Chapter 3. The funerals for Todd Green and Kathy Baker were held the Tuesday morning after the Friday night shootout. The principal at Point High canceled classes for the day, and approximately 1/4 of the student body attended. Todd and Kathy had been popular, and as the minister eulogized them, crying could be heard. But the families of the slain, bunched together in black in the front pews of the chapel, remained silent. Grief was etched on their faces along with hatred. Angela Warner sat at the back of the chapel and wondered if the families knew she was a friend of Mary's. Angela didn't go to the grave sites after the ceremony. She'd had enough of grief. She didn't know why she'd come at all. Yet, deep inside, she did know the reason. It was guilt. She continued to feel she should have spotted Mary's disturbed state of mind before the shots had been fired. Of course, Mary had not acted disturbed, not even after she'd finished her murderous mission. Angela hadn't talked to Mary since Saturday morning. Now she was getting into her car after the ceremony. Jim Klein approached, and she felt no fear of him. She had run over Mary's story 2 or 3 times, and had come to the same conclusion. Something deep inside Mary's mind had snapped. Case closed. "Angie," Jim said, "can I talk to you for a minute?" Jim was what was known as a totally rad dude. God had designed his body and fit him snugly into it. Jim was tall, 6'2", and built like a hardy redwood. His hair was brown, always neat, and his face was chiseled. He had the broad shoulders and strong arms of an experienced quarterback. Yet his brown eyes were somehow clumsy or shy, as was his smile. He moved awkwardly for an athlete. He didn't look particularly intelligent, and that was okay, because if he'd had brains along with that body, there would have been no resisting him. Angela had always been attracted to Jim, and was happy when he'd invited her to his party. She tried not to think about it now. "Sure, we can talk," Angela said, standing beside her open car door. More than half the people weren't going to the grave sites. Her car was trapped in a chapel parking lot by at least 3 other cars. She wasn't going anywhere for a minute anyway. "How's the leg?" she asked. "Better," Jim said, glancing down. "She just winged me." He looked up again, his eyes shifting to the chapel, then back to her. He seemed embarrassed. "I just wanted to thank you for what you did Friday night. You saved my life." Angela chuckled softly. "Lieutenant Nagoyan saved your life. He's the one you should thank." "I wouldn't have been alive for Nagoyan to do anything if you hadn't slowed Mary down at the house and in the woods," Jim said. "If there's anything I can do for you, ever, don't hesitate to ask. I mean that, seriously." Angela blushed. "Maybe some lonely night I'll take you up on that." "No, just kidding. Thanks. I mean, it's okay." Her tone became serious, and she sighed. "I just wish I'd been able to do more, that we weren't having these funerals today." "Ain't that the truth?" Jim said. Twin black hearses waited in front of the chapel. Soon the coffins would be loaded into them. Thankfully, they'd remained closed during the ceremony. Word was that the mortician hadn't been able to do a thing with Kathy's head. "How are the families?" Angela asked. "Real bad." Jim gestured helplessly. "This is all so sudden. They want to strike back, but they can't. Mary will be convicted. There's no chance she'll get off." "I suppose," Jim said miserably. He stuffed his hands in the pockets of his undersized gray suit and focused on his feet. Angela touched his arm. She could feel him shaking beneath her fingers. "What happened?" she asked. "Do you know?" Jim looked at her. "Didn't you talk to her on Saturday?" "Yeah, but I couldn't get anything out of her." "Didn't she say anything?" "Just a bunch of gibberish." "Like what?" Angela shrugged. "I can't even remember most of it." Jim shook his head. "What happened is I told her I wanted to break up with her and go out with other girls. She got real upset. Actually, it caught me by surprise. You know how strong Mary always is. So when she told me I couldn't leave her, that I belonged to her, I didn't know what to do. I avoided her at first, but she kept coming to our practices and wouldn't leave me alone. She called Todd and told him to tell her if I went out with any other girls. She cornered Kathy at school and told her if she so much as looked at me, she'd kill her." Angela frowned. "I can't believe Mary to act that way." "You can't believe it. She was my girl. I thought I knew her better than anybody." "Why did you want to break up with her?" she asked. Jim glanced once more at the hearses, the steps of the chapel. The front line of pallbearers had appeared. Jim was probably supposed to be with them. "This is a lousy place to be having this discussion," he said. "We can talk about it later." she said quickly. Would that be all right? I'd like to talk about a lot of things. How about Friday night, after the game? Are you going to play Friday? She asked, surprised. Yeah, my leg's fine, really. Would you like to get together then? Angela considered a moment. They were at a funeral, a double funeral for that matter. Jim had been Mary's boyfriend, and Mary was her best friend. He was right. This wasn't the time to be discussing such matters. But Jim wasn't asking her out on a date. Not really. He just wanted to talk. There could be no harm in that. Sure, she said. That'd be fine. Angela got home around 11 o'clock. Her grandfather was still asleep. He kept late hours when he was on the prowl for a new woman, which he had been for the last week. A week searching was a long time for him. Angela closed his bedroom door before sitting down at the kitchen table to read the paper. Mary's rampage was still front-page news. Angela had asked the police that her role in the events not be discussed, and so far she had avoided being turned into a hero by the media. She hadn't gone to school on Monday, and didn't know how her classmates were going to treat her. She had no taste for the hero role, especially at the expense of her best friend and 2 dead classmates. Angela had hardly settled herself when there came a knock at her door. It was Kevin Christopher, a guy from her class who lived up the road. Next to Mary, he was the best friend she had in the small community of Point. Their friendship might have been even closer if he hadn't developed an immediate crush on her when they first met at the beginning of the summer. He made no secret of his devotion to her, which both flattered her and made her uneasy. Kevin was short, about 5'8", with a mess of black hair and a grin that would light up at the slightest reference to his favorite subjects, which, of course, were sex and sex. Yet Angela believed Kevin had never had sex outside of the confines of his own head. Too much the altar boy. He was never that crude, even when he was trying to be. He simply didn't have the experience to draw upon, she figured. Not that she had any. In fact, they made a great pair, both virgins pretending they had been around the world on a waterbed. She cared a great deal for Kevin. He made her laugh, and she sure could have used him over the weekend. Yet she hadn't seen him since before the party, and didn't know where he had been. Am I late? He asked as she opened the door. She smiled, although it was forced. The funerals had taken more out of her than she had realized. You are just in time. Come in. Take off your clothes. Let's do it quick. My husband will be back in a few minutes. Kevin jumped inside the door. Where is he? With your wife. The tramp. Really? How would you like it today? Hard and fast, he said. Is there any other way? She asked. Then she laughed as he grabbed her, and she pushed him away. She didn't really feel like clowning around. Calm down, boy. My husband is asleep in the next room. Pretending disappointment, he said. Maybe next time. There's always time, she agreed. They carried on like this whenever they saw each other. It had become a ritual. But sometimes she worried if she hurt his feelings because she was the one who had to bring him back to earth. She wished she had romantic feelings for Kevin. They might even have had fun together. He was handsome enough, but he just didn't do it for her. Not the way, say, Jim Klein did. But we're not going to think about that. He's a monster, remember? He eats poor unsuspecting visitors. Mary had a sick imagination. Maybe she could write horror books in prison and make a fortune. A.N.W., Kevin said, giving her a quick hug. How are you? He often called her Angela Warner, A.N.W., in honor of his favorite root beer. Before she could respond, he let go of her and strode into the house to plop down on the living room couch. It's nice to be home, he said. Her grandfather's place was a 2-story cedar frame built on an open plan, with exposed beams in the vaulted ceiling. The wood was heavily lacquered pine and polished cedar. A huge basement ran the length of the house. The living room's sliding glass windows opened out onto Point Lake, which was calm on this warm, sunny day. Kevin sat and glanced at the water, on the far side of which stood Point High, only a year old. It had been built directly on the shore. Half the classrooms had a great view, which made bored minds wander. Angela went over and sat on the couch beside Kevin. Hey, girl, Kevin said, not meeting Angela. Plastic, her grandpa's collie, came bouncing into the room and shoved her head onto Kevin's lap. Angela loved the dog. She was beautiful, but Plastic had reservations about Angela. Perhaps she resented having another female in the house. But with Kevin, Plastic couldn't show enough affection. She hungrily rose and licked his face. Angela let it go on for a moment until Kevin began to lick her back. She motioned for Plastic to return to her favorite sunning spot, a wooden balcony that jutted out from both her grandfather's upstairs bedroom and her own, 10 feet directly over the water. Plastic could lie on the balcony for hours, staring at the water. One would have thought she was a cat searching for fish, yet the dog never dived in. "Go, girl," Angela said. "Go see the water." Plastic looked at her with her "who the hell do you think you are giving me orders" expression. But she turned and went up the stairs, nudged the slider open, and went out to sun herself. "Smart dog," Kevin remarked. "Yeah," Angela agreed. "She likes you more than me." Most young females in heat do. "Where have you been?" she asked. "I've been here and I've been there, and I've been in between." He paused. "Did you go to the funerals?" "I just got back. How come you didn't go?" "I wasn't invited to the party." Be thankful for small favors. "How were they?" he asked. "The funerals? Awful. I don't know why they bury people. I don't want to be buried." "Do you want to be cremated?" Kevin asked. "I want to be shot into space and dropped into the sun." "Really, where have you been? How come you didn't call me back this weekend? I called you twice." "Did you leave a message?" he asked. "Two." "Can I use the excuse that my machine wasn't working?" he asked. "If you really need to." "But I needed you this weekend." Kevin appeared genuinely concerned. He was ordinarily protective of her. He reached over and put his hand on her knee. "I'm sorry. I went to a computer convention in Chicago. I didn't even know about the shootings until I got back late last night." "How come you didn't tell me you were going to this convention?" "Because I didn't get invited to the party." "You said that already." "Then it must be doubly true," he said. Now she was concerned. "Did it upset you that I went to the party without asking you? You understand it wasn't my party. I couldn't invite people." Kevin nodded. "It was Jim Klein's, I know, and he almost got killed at it. The word is that you saved his life." "That's an exaggeration. The cops saved his life." "I heard you took a bullet that was meant for him." Angela laughed. "These stories. Does it look like I took a bullet meant for anybody?" He studied her for a minute. "You look terrible, Angie," he said quietly. Angela sniffed and lowered her eyes, playing with her fingers, an old habit of hers whenever she was upset. "Of course I look terrible. I feel terrible. 2 people died and Mary's in jail. I don't know. I almost feel like leaving Point and going back to live with one of my parents. They only fought with words. They didn't use shotguns." Kevin moved closer. He put his arm around her, and Angela sagged into his side. "You can't leave," he told her. "I'll go on a rampage if you do. I'll sleep with every girl in school and get them all pregnant, and they'll have to close the place down just to save face. It would be a disaster for the whole state." He leaned over and kissed her cheek. "It'll happen, Angie, dear, if you leave me." She sniffed again and smiled, but her smile didn't last. For all her contact with both Mary and Kevin over the past summer, the two of them didn't really know each other. They moved in separate orbits. "Mary's lost her mind," Angela said softly. "I heard you talk to her at the station," Kevin said. She sat back and wiped her face. "News sure gets around fast. Did you hear what we talked about?" "No. Nobody has any idea why she did it. Everyone is waiting for you to tell them." "If I tell you what she told me, can you keep it secret?" "Absolutely," he said. From experience, she knew Kevin was one to keep his word. "Mary says she had to kill Todd and Kathy and Jim because they were monsters." "I could have told you that," Kevin said with a straight face. "I'm serious, Kev." Kevin blinked. "Tell me the whole story." She did. Everything that had happened the night of the party, and then everything Mary said at the police station. Kevin listened patiently without interrupting. He had a keen mind. He was a straight-A student. As she spoke, she hoped he'd be able to shed new light on what had happened. When she was done, she sat patiently and waited for him to speak. "She certainly sounds like she's lost her mind," he said. "That's what I think. But maybe it's not her fault." "What do you mean?" Angela asked. "I hesitate to bring this up. It probably won't help, but it's a theory I'm sure the papers would get into eventually." "What is it?" "It happened last year before you arrived. Point High had just opened. Before, we used to take buses to Bolton High. It was a pain in the ass, 45 minutes each way, and Bolton High was way overcrowded. Anyway, we got our own school, and everybody was happy until last fall, near the end of football season. That was when a group of students started to get headaches and stomach aches. There were about 30 of them, maybe more. A couple passed out in class, and it wasn't unusual for someone to run to the restroom suddenly to throw up. Everyone got spooked, and a huge meeting of parents and faculty and students was called. Experts were called in to study the school's water. the materials that had been used in constructing the buildings, even the grass and flowers that landscaped the campus. They didn't find a thing wrong, and then suddenly the problems began to diminish. Although they didn't go away altogether, the experts chalked it up to mass hysteria. What do they think brought on the hysteria? Angela asked. They had a few theories. The weirdest one was that summer had gone on too long. We did have strange weather last year. It was November, and we still had some days in the mid-80s. But like I said, the problem seemed to take care of itself. Yet the interesting thing was that only a certain segment of the students was affected. Your story made me remember that. The football players and the cheerleaders? Angela asked. Exactly. I wasn't affected. None of my friends were. But I think all the girls in the cheerleading squad were. I know Kathy Baker was. I remember her mother wrote a nasty letter to the local paper saying how something at the school was poisoning her dear daughter. Was Jim Klein affected? Or Todd Green? I couldn't say for sure. They might have been. Was Mary? Angela asked. I doubt it. I think it was only those two groups. Kevin chuckled. Maybe it was hysteria caused by stress. The football team lost all but 2 games last season. That's not unusual for a school that's just getting started, but I know the players didn't like the ribbings they constantly took. Did any of those who got sick act emotionally distraught? Not that I know of, Kevin said. Then what does this have to do with Mary? The contamination theory, or whatever you want to call it, can't be used to explain what she did. You're looking at it backward, Kevin said. The contamination theory could be used to explain what Mary says the others did. You honestly believe that they did those things? Angela asked. No, as I said, it's just a weird theory. I think Mary blew a circuit and started shooting people. It's happened before, you know. Maybe Jim was dumping her, and she was upset. He told me he was dumping her, Angela said. You talked to him? This morning, at the funerals. She didn't bring up the fact that he had sort of asked her out. Kevin would feel jealous. How is he? Kevin asked. Fine. His leg is better. Already, Kevin asked. I heard she shot him good. That's just a rumor. She barely winged him. Angela stood and paced in front of the couch. I don't want to drop this getting sick business yet. Are you sure the experts found nothing unusual? That was the official announcement. They closed the school for a few days while they took samples of everything. I went up and watched them. They were thorough. Did any of the symptoms return later in the year, like when track and baseball season started? We didn't have a track or a baseball team last year. I'm not sure we'll have one this year. We're still getting the teams together. We only have a student body of 600 to draw from. But to answer your question, I really don't know. Angela stopped her pacing. I just hate to accept the idea that Mary's gone bonkers. She frowned. Maybe those 3 were affected by something and did do strange things. How did Jim seem when you talked to him? Fine, Angela said. Did he look capable of eating anyone alive? Angela waved her head. Even Mary admitted that she never actually saw them hurt anybody. She was quick to blow them away with the little evidence that she had, Kevin said. We could go check out that warehouse. We can't. She couldn't remember where it was. How convenient, Kevin said. Angela nodded. I thought the same thing. Hey, would you like to go to the library with me? I'd like to read more about the reports of the students getting sick. Kevin stood. Sure, as long as you promise me you won't leave the area for fear of catching an invisible disease. Angela chuckled. There's no danger of its being invisible with me. When I catch the least little thing, it always shows. Angela had never been to the library in Point. In Chicago, it might have been mistaken for a private bookshelf. It was dismally small. But they had come only for back issues of the local paper, the Point Herald, and there were plenty of copies available in the back, the librarian said. She was an old woman, perhaps a bit senile, and she must have been losing her sight. She was listening to a book on tape when they entered. As they knelt to collect the issues they wanted, they heard the ghost of Christmas Past chewing out Scrooge for being such a cheap bastard. It took them only a few minutes to find the right papers. As Angela read the articles, she discovered little new. About 3 dozen students had complained of being ill. Doctors were brought in and could find nothing wrong with them. Contractors and chemists were contacted. They, too, couldn't find anything wrong with the school. Then the students had gotten better, the experts had gone away, and everybody was as happy as could be until Mary Blank had crashed a party with a shotgun and a serious attitude problem. There was, however, One thing that Angela learned that she hadn't known before. It came out of an interview with the head of the contracting firm that had built the school. Angela called Kevin over and showed him the quote. "I lost money on the job. The foundation took us 3 times as long as we thought it would because the ground was so hard. Our engineers say the iron content of the soil was 10 times what they thought it would be. We should have built a steel mill there instead of a high school. Maybe the geologists are right when they say the lake was formed by a meteor." "Point Lake was formed by a meteor?" Angela asked. "That's what I've heard," Kevin said. "At least the hole in the ground was. The water came later, of course." "Where does Point High get its water?" "From the lake. Didn't you know that?" "No," she said. "Angie, there's nothing wrong with the water. I drink it, you drink it, and there's nothing wrong with us. Besides, they tested the water inside out when the students started to get sick. It's perfectly okay." "Is that where my grandfather's water comes from?" she asked. Kevin thought a moment. "I don't think so. I think he gets it from a well high up on the hill, where my family gets theirs. Lots of people on our side of the lake get their water from there." "Why get water from a well when a lake's sitting right there?" "I don't know," he said. "Good question. You said that some people say the lake was formed by a meteor. Do other people disagree? First off, it's not that unusual to have a lake, or any body of water for that matter, formed by a meteor. They say Hudson Bay was created by a meteor long ago. But as far as Point Lake is concerned, there haven't been any studies done to be sure. Personally, I think a meteor must have formed it." "Why does our young scientist believe that?" Angela asked. "Because you can't get a proper reading on a compass in this town. The needles just spin. The iron in the ground here is magnetic, and meteors are often magnetic. But before we go too far with this, I must say again that the students getting sick and Mary's going berserk has nothing to do with the water or that meteor. If that were the case, we'd all have been affected. In fact, thousands of people would have been affected for the past 100 years, since this town was built. Even before then, the Indians were here first. As far as I know, the water didn't bother them." Angela shivered, although she didn't know why. Maybe it was just the thought of living beside a lake that had been carved out by something from outer space that made her feel suddenly chilly. She remembered again how cold the lake water always was, even in the summer. "I suppose you're right," she said distractedly. Chapter 4. Friday night found Angela at the football game. There had been talk all week long of canceling the game out of respect for Todd and Kathy, but it was finally decided that the contest could be dedicated to the two, rather than abandoned. It was the first game of the new school year, and it was against Bolton High, played in Bolton Stadium because Point High didn't yet have one of its own. Angela had had an interesting week at school. Everywhere she went, people talked in whispers at her back. She had dual claims to fame. She had helped stop Mary, and she was Mary's best friend. She supposed one was good and the other bad, but she didn't know if they canceled each other out. Actually, she talked to very few people all week. When she didn't see Jim Klein around, she assumed his leg was bothering him more than he had let on. Yet Friday night he was starting quarterback. Angela had gone to the game without Kevin. She felt guilty about that. When he'd asked her if she wanted to go to a movie, she had answered that she wanted to stay home. There was no chance he'd attend the game because he disliked football as much as he disliked football players. Angela sat by herself up in the stands after buying herself a couple of hot dogs and a large Coke. Mary was much on her mind, especially after she'd spoken to her parents briefly on Thursday. A difficult conversation. It wasn't as if Mary were recovering from an illness or anything. "Hi, how's your daughter? How's her cell? Does she like her striped pajamas? I hear she's got a rapist for a cellmate. Yeah, that's tough when the warden won't even let her call collect." Angela hadn't known what to say. Apparently, though, Mary had yet to have her bail hearing with the judge. Mary's parents didn't know why it was taking so long. They sounded so sad it broke Angela's heart. The game started. Angela tried to push away her gloomy thoughts and enjoy it. Ordinarily, she liked football. She pretty much liked all sports and had hoped to go out for volleyball or basketball. She was disappointed that no teams had been formed yet, and might not be until after she graduated. At a glance, it was clear Bolton High was the favorite. As both teams lined up for the kickoff, Angela could see how much bigger Bolton's players were. The reason was simple. Bolton High had a student body 5 times Point's size. 5 times as many kids to draw from. Angela stood and cheered as Point received the kickoff. She hoped it would be a good game. Point ran the ball back to the 20-yard line, and the offensive unit, led by Jim Klein, came onto the field. Then Jim would pass. He would throw tight, clean spirals that you could hardly see. When they hit the receivers, the guys would double up as if they had been shot. Those passes would hurt, and I mean hurt. In the next 6 minutes, in the opening drive of the game, Angela watched Jim throw 5 complete passes, the final one 30 yards into the end zone for a touchdown. All of them were tight spirals, but none of his passes made his receivers double up in pain. He did appear to throw them hard, however, and accurately. His performance was amazing, to say the least. But Angela did not get the impression she was watching a superhuman play. In fact, she hardly thought about what Mary had said once she was into the game. And a fine game it was from Point's perspective. Bolton might have been bigger, but they weren't as quick or as coordinated. Point quickly jumped to a 2-touchdown lead. By the end of the first half, the score was 21-7, and it seemed as if Point was just getting warmed up. As the players jogged to the lockers for the halftime break, Angela hurried down to the bleachers toward the fence that separated the stands from the playing field. Jim was one of the last players to leave the field. 3 tiers up still, she was able to call down to him as he passed by. She hoped she wasn't drawing undue attention to the act. "You are killing those guys," she said. He removed his helmet and raised his head. Right then, at that moment, he didn't look anything like a clumsy jock. He looked more like a conquering gladiator. He flashed her a quick smile. "Are we still on for tonight?" "I'm on if you're on," she said. "I'll meet you outside the showers 20 minutes after the game." "I'll be there." It was sounding more like a date all the time. The second half was a repeat of the first half, except it was more devastating. Point ran off 2 touchdowns in a row before Bolton could respond with a field goal. There was nothing supernatural at work. Bolton was simply being outplayed, both offensively and defensively. They were also being outcoached. Only 2 players came out with injuries, both on Bolton's side. 2 is not a lot to lose in a football game, Angela thought. It was probably below average. The second player, though, hurt in a pile-up in the last 5 minutes, did have to be carried off the field. The final score was 42-9. Jim had completed over 3/4 of his passes. She met him outside Bolton's showers long after the 20 minutes he had promised. She didn't mind. He was quick to apologize and looked so handsome with his wet hair and equipment bag thrown nonchalantly over his shoulder that she considered herself lucky. She had to remind herself that the purpose of their date, she had begun to call it that in her mind, was to discuss a tragic matter. Jim, though, pumped by his team's victory, appeared to have thrown off the gloom of last week's incident. "I think we scared them in the first few minutes," he said as they walked toward the parking lot. The night was warm. Maybe they'd have another one of those long summers. "They just rolled over and played dead." "It looked so easy I was afraid I'd get bored," she said. He paused and turned to her. "I hope I didn't bore you." She laughed quickly, embarrassed. "No, you were incredible. I don't see how you guys lost a single game last year with you at the helm." "I improved a lot since last year. We all did," he added quietly. "I think playing this game for Todd and Kathy gave us an extra spark tonight." She nodded. "I'm sure they appreciate it, wherever they are." Jim raised his head to the stars. "Yeah," he muttered. Then he shook himself. "Are you hungry?" "I just ate 2 hot dogs." "But you haven't had dessert. Let's go somewhere to eat." "Okay." She gestured to the far end of the lot, where her car was parked. "I have my car. Would you like to meet me somewhere?" He grinned. "Afraid to come with me?" She was glad it was dark so he couldn't see her blush. She poked him in the chest, feeling hard, smooth muscle. "You don't scare me, big boy." They did end up taking separate cars back to Point. They met at a local restaurant called Cider Cafe. The game had been relatively early, 6:30, and they were seated in the restaurant before 10 o'clock. The place was upscale. There was nobody from school there. Angela remembered that Jim's family, like Mary's, had money. Jim ordered a New York steak, shrimp, a baked potato, salad, vegetables, and milk. He said he was always starving after a game. She asked for herb tea. The hot dogs had given her indigestion. "Should we get the unpleasantries out of the way first?" Jim asked as they waited for their food. "The shootings in Mary?" she asked. "Yeah." Jim folded his powerful hands and leaned across the table. His dark eyes, in the light from the candle, were anything but cold. They were warm and most enchanting, and she had to consciously stop herself from staring too long into them. "I didn't tell you the whole story at the cemetery about Mary and me," he said. "What did you leave out?" "I told you that I'd said I wanted to go out with other girls, and she freaked out." "Yes?" Jim cleared his throat. "This is embarrassing. I realize now I shouldn't have been so tactless and told her who I wanted to date. At the time, though, I thought it was better to tell her than to have her find out on her own." Angela took a deep breath. "Yes?" "I wanted to ask you out." "Really?" "Yeah," he said. "You told her that?" "Yeah." "You shouldn't have told her that." Jim sat back and sighed. "I know that now." "God!" Angela said. Then she blinked. Jim Klein wanted to leave Mary for her? Maybe there was something wrong with him. Her amazement forced a question out of her. "Why did you want to go out with me?" she asked. He appeared to be stunned, then chuckled. "I like you." "Why? I mean, you hardly know me." "Haven't you ever liked someone you hardly knew?" "Yes." A perfect example was sitting right across from her. "But Mary's so incredible." Angela shook her head. She was flattered and totally confused. She must have been shocked. Jim appeared to be disgusted. "Obviously." His remark sobered her quickly. "Do you hate her?" "No. Yes. I can't hate her, but I want to. Todd was my friend." "How about Kathy?" She was already thinking about the competition. "Kathy was a friend, too. We all used to go out together." "Mary told me." Jim's interest was piqued. "What did she tell you?" Angela paused. Just being in a restaurant with Jim made her feel disloyal to Mary. There was no sense embarrassing Mary in front of Jim. "She said that you grew cold and uninterested," Angela said carefully. Jim was impatient. "That happens when people break up. I thought she would have been mature enough to accept what was happening and get on with her life. What else did she tell you?" "Nothing." "Did you see her Saturday morning?" he asked. "I told you I did. She refused to tell me why she did it. She didn't mention anything about you wanting to go out with me." "I didn't mean to lay such a heavy rap on your shoulders." "It's not your fault," she said quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't want to say what she did next, but she owed it to Mary. "Mary's still my friend." Jim nodded. "I understand if you don't want to see me." "I didn't—" "Angie." "What?" "What were you going to say?" he asked. "I don't know." "I guess this is all too quick for you," Jim said sympathetically. She stared at the candle on the table, then back into Jim's eyes. They had flecks of purple around the irises. She had never noticed that before. Such unusual eyes. She imagined she could see the flame of the candle burning behind them. "He's too hot for me." "I like you," she said softly. Again he was interested. "What do you like about me?" "The body you're wearing under those clothes." "Your piercing intellect and subtle wit," she said. He smiled. "You're making fun of me." She shrugged. "I just like you. You're cute." He reached over and took her hands in his. "You're cute." He could see the blood in her cheeks now. "Next to Mary, I look like old wallpaper." "Mary's in jail. Mary's going to stay in jail. Let's not talk about her any more." He raised a finger as she started to protest. His tone had gone hard all of a sudden. "At least not tonight. All right? Let's have fun." She lowered her head, feeling like Judas. "All right." Jim's food came, and he ate. Boy, did he eat. She sipped her tea and restrained herself from lecturing him on the virtues of chewing. When he had cleared his plate, he ordered dessert, cheesecake, and insisted she have a bite. He liked it so much he had a double helping, although she thought it dry. But she liked watching him eat. Just watching him. He paid for the meal with his father's credit card. "What do you want to do now?" he asked as they stepped outside into the night air. The warmth of the day continued to linger, although it was getting close to midnight. "Go to bed," she said. He laughed and clapped her on the back. "You Chicago girls get right down to business, don't you?" "I meant sleep." He had hit her a bit harder than she would have preferred, but he was so darling that it was okay. He continued to chuckle. "I know what you meant. I didn't mean to embarrass you." "We Chicago girls don't get embarrassed that easily." "Wow, what's that mean?" She giggled. "I'm not that tired. Follow me back to my house in your car. We can go for a walk. Along the lake?" "Wherever you like, Jim." Jim almost killed them both when he arrived at her house. He tried pulling in beside her in the driveway, but there wasn't room. He ended up banging her grandfather's propane tank with the front bumper on his four-wheel drive. He leapt out of the vehicle when he saw what he'd done. "Did I break the seal on it?" he asked. Reaching inside his truck, he eased the vehicle back slightly. Angela dashed over to the tank. Being from a city, she wasn't experienced with propane. She studied the tank in his headlights. He had definitely dented the metal, and it worried her. He joined her a moment later, touching the twisted white curve with his big hand. "I think it's okay," he said. "Are you sure? Should I wake my grandfather?" "It's fine for now. If it was leaking, we'd know it. But it should be checked in the morning. If it needs to be repaired, I'll pay for it." "It won't explode?" When she had originally moved into the house, she had felt as if she were sleeping next to an atomic bomb. "It'd take a full collision to get a tank like this to explode." Jim paused to study the length of the 40-foot prone cylinder. "But I'm surprised your grandfather has such a big tank. You usually find one this size on a farm, where a huge barn has to be heated." "My grandfather explained to me that until 10 years ago, there used to be 5 houses around here. They all used the same tank." "What happened to them?" "I think they burned down," Angela said. "You would have been 8 then. Do you remember anything like that?" "Vaguely." "You have lived in Point all your life, haven't you?" "Yeah." He nodded to the tank. "A big fire could have set this sucker off." "What would such an explosion do?" she asked. "If the tank had just been filled, it would blow away the house." He snapped his fingers. "Just like that." "I think my grandfather just had it filled." He laughed. "Then I'll try not to run into it again." Angela had visions of huge explosions in her head. For no reason, they excited her. "If it blew, would it make a crater in the ground?" "What?" "You know, like a small meteor had hit here." "I don't think it would do that. Why do you ask?" "Just wondering," she said. Angela ran inside to use the bathroom before they went for their walk. Jim followed her in. Plastic was asleep on the living room sofa. The dog didn't even stir. Naturally, her grandfather wasn't at home. Jim made a joke about him and said he had quite a reputation around town. He almost sounded envious. A few minutes later, they were walking hand in hand along the shore of the lake. Angela didn't know who would reach for whom, but together felt right. Her guilt about Mary stayed with her, but she tucked it aside. She could worry about it later. Her fingers almost disappeared inside Jim's. They walked without saying much, and that was nice. A half-moon hung low in the west, the silver rays glittering on the water, on the bare skin of their arms. The only sound was the rhythmic swish of oil wells, high up on the hills that overlooked the lake. Although partly hidden by trees, Angela felt the wells were an unnecessary blight on a local beauty. She said as much to Jim. "Those wells make a fortune," he said. "They've pumped better than 1,000 barrels a day for the past 5 years, and they don't make much noise. You can only hear them now because it's late, and everything's quiet. They're modern wells, and work on air pressure rather than gasoline motors." "You sound like you like them." He grinned. "My dad owns a 20% interest in all 12 of them. The car I drive came from money from those wells." She let go of his hand and shoved him playfully in the side. "Here you're not even out of high school, and you've sold out to the money-hungry destroyers of our environment." He grabbed her and pulled her close. "Who cares about this world? It's only here for our pleasure." "What about our children, and our children's children?" "I can't worry about them." "You should," she said, feeling his warm breath on her face. "Why? They might never be born." He kissed her. He kissed the way he ate, and that wasn't bad. Deep and hard, but still with enjoyment. She felt herself sink into him. He pulled her tight against his body. He was like a redwood, strong and firm. His arms went around her, and his hands went down her back and over her butt. He was aggressive, Mary had told her, but she wasn't Mary, although last summer she wished many times she had been. She wasn't an expert in the art of making love. She had never even had a guy touch her below the waist. Jim moved his right hand to the front of her blouse and started to slip it down. God, it felt good, just his fingers getting close, but she pulled back. "Don't I get a chance to come up for air?" she asked, trying to joke. He reached for her. "I'll give you my air." She held up her hand. "Hold on a sec. This is a little fast for me." He smiled. He dropped his hands to his side and stared out at the water. "Do you want to go for a swim?" he asked. "The water's too cold." He started removing his shirt. Ha, we're both hot. Besides, the night's warm. Come on. I don't have a bathing suit. He pulled his shirt over his head, laughing. That's the best part. Angela felt dismayed. This was their first date, after all. Nothing like this had ever happened to her in Chicago. Jim unzipped his pants and began to pull them off. It didn't look as if he were wearing any underwear. Wait, she said. What? I can't swim, she lied. We don't have to go out deep. I have a cold. Angie. I'm just getting over one, really. I shouldn't go in the water. He threw back his head and laughed at the moon. I'm going swimming. You can join me if you want, or you can watch. But you better be careful if you watch, because I might suddenly jump out and pull you in. I've done it before, you know. She giggled nervously. I didn't know that. Angela tried not to look while he pulled off his pants, but she ended up getting an eyeful. He had a nice... Well, he was a nice boy, in all respects. Great buns. Except he was kind of pushy, a side of him she had never seen before. It was funny how you really didn't know someone till you got intimate with them. This is not intimacy. This is sexual insanity. Jim ran naked into the water, splashing like a kid. At waist level he dived under, and she counted more heartbeats than she wanted before he reappeared at least 50 yards farther out. He was a powerful swimmer. The light of the moon swam around him, and the ripples he sent out were like miniature silver waves. Come on, he called. Next time, she called back. He swam to the center of the lake, a quarter of a mile out, and had her worried that he'd cramp up and drown. But then he rolled onto his back and leisurely began to paddle back in. She took off a shoe and touched her water with the foot. She shook her head. It must be fed with underground streams, she thought. The daytime temperature had averaged over 80 degrees for the last few months, and the water couldn't have been more than 60 degrees. Jim must have a hardy constitution. She saw an example of that hardy constitution a few minutes later when he reached the shore and came running out of the water toward her. She couldn't believe it. Until a few days ago, her life was dull, and now she had a hunk, naked no less, chasing her in the middle of the night. She took one look at him and realized he had every intention of dragging her into the water, clothes and all. She ran off the grassy shore and into the trees. She'd be damned if Jim wasn't still hot on her tail. I have a cold, she shouted back to him. I don't believe you, he answered. Angela darted behind a couple of bushes, hoping to lose him, and bent down low to hide. She figured he'd be able to spot her in a second, and had resigned herself to a drenching when she suddenly heard him cry out in pain. She stood up tentatively, figuring it might be a ruse, but she spotted him only 50 feet away, kneeling beside a tree, holding his right arm. It looked as if he'd tripped and cut himself. Surprisingly, he had his pants on again. He gets dressed and undressed faster than anybody I've ever seen. She hurried to his side and helped him up. I guess I was in too much of a hurry to catch you, he said rather sheepishly. God, she whispered. His right arm was covered with blood. She couldn't even see where the cut was. What happened? I ran into a tree. He touched the tree they were standing beside. This one. Does it hurt? The tree. It did when it came running at me. She giggled. Silly. That's what you get for trying to drench me. Come on, let's go back to my place. I can dress it for you. He was agreeable to the idea at first, but when they got to where he had deposited his shirt, he wanted to wash the cut in the lake and bandage it with his shirt. Tear it into strips, in other words. The wound was still bleeding, but Angela thought that was a bit extreme. Why don't you just put pressure on it, she suggested. That will stop the bleeding. Because it hurts. I don't want to touch it. She nodded to the lake. Is this water clean enough? We drink it every day at school. So I've heard. What have you heard? He asked. Never mind. Okay, let's wash it. She reached down and picked up his shirt. At least we'll be able to see how bad it is. I'm surprised how much it stings, Jim said. She suspected it was a nasty cut indeed. He hesitated before dipping it in the water. She knelt beside him and got her pants wet too. Do you want me to help you? She asked. Am I acting like a baby? Not at all. Good, he said. Can I kiss you again? Yes, but first, let's... He shut her up by leaning over and planting his lips on hers. He couldn't have been in that much pain. Once more he kissed her long and hard. Again she felt his hands in her body, tugging at the buttons on the front of her blouse. She tried to stop him, but he persisted, and she didn't really want him to stop anyway. Actually, she wanted him to strip her naked and make passionate love to her right on the spot. He leaned her head back on the grass and pulled her blouse open. She had a bra on, but that wouldn't be an obstacle to him for long. Not this guy. This is a hell of a way to get to know each other. Then she felt a warm, sticky liquid being smeared across her belly as he squeezed her closer. It was totally silly of her, but for a moment she had forgotten he was bleeding. She sat up with a start, knocking him back. "You're bleeding all over me," she cried. "It's okay." "No, it's not okay." Her blouse was lying completely open. He had snapped free a couple of buttons in his eagerness to get to her breasts. The blouse was badly stained with blood, as was much of her belly and chest. She couldn't believe he had managed to bleed on her that much during just one kiss. She wondered how long it had lasted. "You've made a mess of us both," she complained. He laughed. "It'll wash off." "I don't think so." She paused. "How's your arm?" He held it up to the moonlight, seemingly without a care in the world, and she could see that it was soaked with blood, more even than a few minutes ago. "It doesn't look like it's going to fall off in the next minute," he said. "Jim, you're really bleeding. You might have sliced a vein." "That's why I wanted to tear up my shirt," he said. "You just wanted to tear off my clothes." He grabbed at her again. "Yeah." She pushed him back. "We have to stop this bleeding." He grinned wolfishly. "Why don't you kiss it and make it better?" He held it up to her face for her to do so. "Just a little peck." She turned her head. "You're making me sick. Where's your shirt? I'm going to tie it on your arm, the whole thing. Let's not wash the wound in the water. It'll only encourage the bleeding." "All right, Angie." She knotted her shirt directly over the spot where she believed the cut to be. Jim gave a grunt but said nothing. She sat for a minute to see if the bleeding decreased. It appeared to do so. Her hands, all her clothes, were by this time covered with blood. "It's getting better," she said, moving to get up. "Let's get back." "In a minute." "Jim." He grabbed her and started kissing her again. Somebody had eaten his Wheaties that morning, but they were both smeared with gook that the passion had lost all charm for Angela. Well, most of the charm. It still felt good to have his mouth on hers. He tasted great, like the steak he'd eaten for dinner, that rare steak. Angie, dear, that might be the taste of his blood. The thought was enough to cool her down. She finally managed to push him back and jump to her feet before he could kiss her again. "We're going back," she said. He glanced up at her and flashed a little boy's smile. "So soon?" "Yes." She offered him her hand. "Before the sun comes up." He kissed her once more as she said goodbye to him at his car. He wouldn't let her take him to a doctor, because he said his arm was fine. He touched her right breast, under the bra, while he gave her the last kiss. She couldn't believe she let him. Mary said he was a monster, all right. But a dreamy thought swam in Angela's mind as she let him touch her. Maybe he's my kind of monster. Angela eventually found herself in bed, alone under her covers. Supposedly alone, yet remarkably, she was with strange company in an alien world. The world was alive. It had been for billions of years, ever since it could remember. Of course, nothing, no matter how alien, could remember death. For that reason, the world believed it was immortal. Life would come to its surface, and it would kill it in that special way, and eat it, and give it everlasting life as it became part of itself. The world would go on, and nothing, it believed, could stop it. The world was always hungry, especially for those who visited. They were such easy prey. Angela felt like a visitor as she walked through the flowered meadow. The sun was bright, yet somehow smaller than she remembered it should be, but that didn't matter. She had entered paradise and was happy. It had been a long journey, and now she could rest, free and unwatched. Sweet aromas saturated the air. At a stream, she knelt to refresh herself with a drink. But before she could sample the water, she sat up with a start, for the sun had suddenly gone behind a dark cloud that had not been there a minute before. As it disappeared, the meadow grew dark, but not in a normal way. The light changed to a sober red as the rays of the sun filtered through the strange cloud, floating in the sky above her head like some diseased heart. "God!" Angela whispered, peering up at the sky. But God was not there. Not in this place, surely not. Angela began to feel hot. A smell pushed its way into her nostrils. Not sweet or pleasant, but familiar. Yes, she knew what it was. "No," Angela whispered. "No, God." A bolt of lightning cracked the sky. It could have split it open, the underbelly of a massive airborne demon. But it was just a cloud that had burst, although it was no ordinary cloud. Now drops of blood fell as rain to earth. But wasn't that the fatal joke? She wasn't on Earth, couldn't be. She had traveled far to enter paradise, and had accidentally stumbled into hell. The blood soaked her. Soon it was all she could smell, all she could see. A river ran red at her feet, but the blood didn't just fall from the sky onto the world. First, it was sucked up from the ground. Something mingled with the blood at her feet. This something was the brain cells of the world. The cells that gave the world thought, desire, cravings. The world had huge appetites that would never be filled. Such bitter sweetness, this hunger, especially when it swam in the juices of previous harvests, around the raw flesh of the next unsuspecting victim. A horrible pain started in Angela's feet. She screamed, hopping from foot to foot, trying to get away from the million invisible teeth that were trying to devour her. The pain, though, was much too great. She couldn't maintain her balance. She tripped, and in an instant the monster in the blood was over her body, on her face, even in her mouth, where it began to dine on the choicest of meats. Angela sat bolt upright in bed, her heart pounding, her nightgown soaked. Before she could catch her breath, her guts lurched, and she had to run to the bathroom. She was barely in time to lose the contents of her stomach into the toilet. For a minute, she sat dazed on the floor of the bathroom, drawing in deep, burning breaths that did little to warm the awful coldness in her limbs. I'm getting the flu. It must be a killer. Eventually, she made her way back to bed. But she didn't go back to sleep right away. She didn't want to have that dream again. Never.